Hi everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm delighted and honoured to be speaking with Craig Pickering. Craig, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Hiya, thanks for having me.
Really excited to get you on. Why don't we start by getting you to introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Craig Pickering. A good while ago now, I was an athlete, so I was a 100-metre runner. I went to a couple of World Championships and Olympics in that, and then in 2012 I switched sports to bobsleigh. So I was picked for the 2014 Winter Olympics in that for Great Britain. But unfortunately I got a career-ending injury just before that, so I was picked but couldn't compete, and off the back of that I retired, and so I had to find a real job. So I worked for a genetic testing company for a little bit, got a doctorate, and I'm currently working as athlete pathway manager at Athletics Australia.
So you're out in sunny Australia?
I am, yes. I've been here for 5 years now, so I'm a citizen, so I don't think I'll be making a move home anytime soon.
I don't blame you. I don't blame you at all. Question for you before we actually get started on the athletics chat. Psychological differences between the Brits and the Aussies. Anything that's obvious, anything that stands out, could be relevant to sport?
There's a lot of stuff which is reasonably obvious when you sort of come over here. So I guess the lifestyle is substantially more relaxed. There's like an inherent need for work-life balance, and in fact it's probably life balance first as opposed to work. So actually I tend to find Australian businesses like British people coming over because they haven't quite figured out the work-life balance that Australians have, so they sort of feel they work a little bit harder. Yeah, so that's probably the main thing. And then, yeah, it's just everything's just a little bit less structured and less rule-based over here than I find it is in the UK, which is not to say it's necessarily any better. Sometimes that's a bit frustrating, but I guess, yeah, it's just different.
That's really interesting. Less structured, less rule-based. I wonder how much that feeds into team sports and the style in which Aussies play team sports. I wonder if it lends towards more creative players.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, they're definitely more relaxed about things. You don't see, in my experience, I don't see as many uptight Australians as I do see uptight British people. And as an uptight British person, I don't feel harsh in saying that, really. So yeah, certainly that's probably something that sort of plays into it a little bit more. And I wonder if their psychological approach to competition is a little bit more, that we'll be all right, as opposed to, in my experience, just sort of focusing on competition a lot more and being anxious about it. If they're a little bit free of that anxiety, do they play a little bit looser and a little bit more creative, like you said? Yeah, definitely an interesting thought.
So on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being completely uptight and 1 being completely relaxed, you're almost asleep, where were you when you got on a plane 5 years ago, and where are you now?
I was in my athletics career, I would have been a 10. I think post-retirement, I was probably an 8. So getting on the plane, yeah, probably an 8. And then now, probably a healthy middle of the ground, somewhere between 4 and 6, I suspect. It depends on the scenario, but I'm still, I'm more uptight than most people that I work with, but less uptight than I used to be.
Now, being a raving psychologist, you've given me a lovely segue to move on to your athletics career, because you just said something very interesting. You said I would have been 10 out of 10 when I was running, and now I'd be between 4 and 6. Big, bold question here, Craig. Would you have been a more successful... You were a very successful sprinter, but would you have been a more successful sprinter had you taken the 4 to 6 mentality you have now as opposed to the 10 you had then?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, it's a really hard question to answer. So I guess I wonder if part of the reason I was as good as I was by no means world class by any stretch of imagination, in 10 seconds or anything like that, but around a bit, and I was reasonably consistent. I wonder if being uptight drives that a little bit. I was always really curious as to what drove success, and sort of was always driven to find out various different things I could do to improve my performance, and was kind of like probably not obsessive but close to about structure and set sleep times, diet, and things like that. And that's obviously positive in some aspects because that's what you need to be successful. But similarly, I suppose certainly for 1 year of my career I suffered from overtraining syndrome, which I would suspect being uptight drove part of that, because I didn't have a particularly good year in 2009. I didn't reach my goals, and so my reaction to that was, well, if I just train harder, that'll solve all those problems. And of course, like it's particularly in sprinting where actually what you need is high quality and high intensity training. Training hard is not the solution there. In fact, actually, you probably want fewer, by that I mean less frequent, hard training sessions, but the hard training sessions you do have to be of ridiculous intensity. So actually, if you look at it from that perspective, being less uptight would have been quite useful because I wouldn't have been pushing myself as hard as I needed to all the time. So it's probably a mixture of two. I think you probably need some uptightness to drive, or at least enjoy the structure and the rigor and the support that goes around that. But conversely, I suppose you probably need times where you can switch off away from the track. And certainly, at some points in my career, I definitely didn't have that ability to switch off, or didn't switch off as well as I should have done in hindsight.
So rather than hitting the 4 to 6 and rather being at 10 somewhere around the 8 mark.
Yeah. Or like if you can just have structure without being obsessive about it. So like, I mean, I used to sort of, when I used to go out for food with my friends, that used to cause anxiety for me because I'd be like, well, I'd rather be at home doing some stretching, or they're all going to have an alcoholic drink and I'm not, and so what's going to happen there? Or if they're going to have a dessert, can I actually have that? And really, like, if I look back, if I'd had a dessert once with my friends, that would have made no difference in my outcomes. But at the time, you are thinking about that a lot. It plays in your mind, and so potentially that's certainly a negative side of my personality, which wouldn't have been beneficial. So it's hard to know. Kind of, I guess, like you said, a mixture of the two would have been a better outcome.
Well, Craig, what I'd like to do is just take a step back, because you said some really interesting things there, and there's certainly some things I'd like to explore, and I think that exploration is going to allow us to move on to the welfare, wellness, overtraining, sort of stress piece that we want to talk about. But can we just take a step back a second, because you've introduced yourself and you talked a little bit about your athletics, but I think there's definitely going to be people, I'm sure most people listening in know who you are and know your achievements, but for those who don't, I mean, you went to the Olympics, you did win medals in the relays, you won World Championship medals as well, didn't you? So can you just give us a brief synopsis of your 100 metre career and 60 metre career?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I was always very quick. So I used to just beat people at school that were 2 or 3 years older than me. And then when I went to secondary school, I broke the school record on my first sports day there. So my PE teacher just sort of said, well, why don't you go to athletics club, see you go? And I didn't want to go because I just assumed that everybody would be much better than I was. But eventually my parents sort of cajoled me to go. I won my first race by about a second, I think. And then a year later, I was the under-15 national champion in the UK, and I ran the second fastest time by a 14-year-old in British history. So off the back of that, I was like, well, I've probably got some natural talent. Let's see how this goes. 2 years after that, I came third at the World Under-18 Championships. 2 years after that, I then won the European Under-20 Championships. And then, so I was 18 at that point. And then when I was sort of between 19 to 23 is probably my golden years, were really where I went to World Championships 100 metres and made the semi-final in 2007. I made the quarter-final at the Olympics in 2008. But yeah, in 2007 I also won a bronze medal in the 4x1 relay at the World Championships and a silver medal at the European Indoors over 60 metres. So I had like a decent enough career for probably those 4 years, and then the wheels came off a little bit with overtraining syndrome and then a couple of injuries, which just sort of led to my demise, really. Okay,
so what was your best time?
So if people aren't athletics fans, I would say my best time was 10.08 seconds. That is actually just ever so slightly wind assisted. So that was with a 2.1 tailwind. The legal limit is 2.0. So my legal personal best is 10.14 seconds.
10.14 seconds or 10.08. When you reflect back, I love athletics, and I've done a little bit of work with athletes in my sports psychology career, but I certainly wouldn't say I've been embedded within that environment by any stretch of imagination, so please excuse my naive questions. But I suppose from the outside looking in, that 10 seconds, that 10-second barrier, seems like a bit of a barrier. When you reflect back, do you think that's something that you could have crossed? Or is that not such a relevant thing?
I kind of when I look back at my career now, I'd suggest that I didn't reach my potential. So if I look at my results when I was between 14 and 20, like I was quick off not much training and with things not going right. So I ran 10.22 as an 18-year-old. So you think like that's probably a decent marker of natural talent. And then I progressed reasonably well after that for a couple of years, and then I just had really bad luck with injuries and things like that. Which, I don't think I met my potential. I think it's difficult to say if I could have run in 10 seconds. Certainly, there's been races that I've run into headwinds where if you convert the time, it's certainly a low 10.0 something if it's with a legal tailwind. So there's glimmers like that which suggest I could have potentially done it. I can't say the way, but I certainly think I could have come closer than I did.
How much did psychology play a part in your development and in your performances?
Probably a lot. And then at the time, I probably didn't pay potentially as enough attention to it as I would have done now, perhaps. So I guess I really like sports science and I always have. So when I started GCSE PE at school when I was 14, I got a textbook. And I read that textbook over a weekend because I was just like, well, everything in here I can apply to my sport and take it on and think about it. And obviously psychology is a part of that. And then I guess it just sort of was doing that based off what you learned at GCSE PE, which is not much. It's catastrophe theory or things like inversion theory, that type of thing. And then I went to the World Under-18 Championships when I was 16. And in the heat, I ran a personal best, feeling quite comfortable. And I thought, well, off the back of this, I actually could well win a medal here. And then in the semi-final, I was just really, really nervous. Just really anxious about my performance. And I ran really badly. I just qualified for the final. I was the last person to qualify as the fastest loser. And so then I was in heat one for the final and thinking, well, my chance is gone. But the team coach was like, you need to sort yourself out here. Like, you can't allow yourself to run like you ran a semi-final because you're better than that. So I managed to somehow turn around the final, got a bronze medal. But on reflection, after that competition, I was like, well, I really can't afford to let that happen again, because if you want to be successful as a sprinter, you have to perform under pressure quite a lot, and you actually have to probably like that. So I started working with a sports psychologist, and honestly, it was one conversation where the sports psychologist, Sarah Cecil, she just said, do you know that do you think being nervous is good, or do you think it's been bad? And I was like, no, it's probably quite a good thing because it means I'm going to perform well. And that was just like a switch in my head. So as soon as she said that, the feeling of being nervous, once I viewed it as being facilitative, it just really helped my performance. And then I didn't really use sports psychology much after that because I didn't really have any problems, and probably my attitude at that point was sports psychology is something you do when you have an issue, which is a very old school way of approaching it. But that was my approach. And then, so I just sort of went through that, and then probably been exposed to challenging environments quite young. So I went to the World Championships at 18 in the 4x1 relay squad. I never had it easy as a youngster, so there was always people that could beat me. I always lost more races than I could have won. So I was kind of naturally put in, I guess what Dave Collins would call like the rocky road sort of thing, whereby I had these scenarios which weren't positive for me, and then I learned myself to analyse what had gone on and make sure it didn't happen again, and how to deal with adversity. So it's probably like naturally just had that. That's probably that's part of it. And then just my own makeup is that I'm reasonably pragmatic anyway, so I think that certainly helps you kind of deal with pressure and that kind of thing. So I got to the point where I actually needed pressure to perform. After I'd been to World Championships and Olympics, I couldn't really be bothered with like small competitions, and I'd run quite badly at them. And then you think, well, have I lost it? And then you go to run a race where the pressure was on, and you'd absolutely smash it and realise, no, you still got it, but you just need, motivation has to be a little bit different. That's probably, it didn't play much role. It didn't play an obvious role through sports psychologists during my career. I certainly worked with them on and off at various times, but I felt psychologically robust enough to perform well at the highest level most of the times. There's obviously some situations where that didn't happen.
It's interesting. Some of the things you said there, I lost more races. I lost races I perhaps should have won. You said that from a motivational perspective, sometimes if you went to smaller meets, especially towards the tail end of your career, you wouldn't be as motivated, and you realised you needed the pressure of the bigger meets. Did you have any kind of, I suppose I would call it a mental skills framework, but any kind of framework by which, I mean, even a routine, things that you did that helped you get into, let's say, an optimal mental state and stay there irrespective of who you were running against? Or was it a bit more kind of, a little bit more chaotic, a bit more hit and miss?
No, it wasn't chaotic. It was structured. So I figured out that, like I kind of alluded to, I liked routine quite a lot. So I figured out that a set warm-up routine actually helped me sort of psychologically get into the zone to perform.
Okay.
Now, certain things had to fall in line. Like it still had to be a competition which mattered a lot. Now, you can obviously play with that and try and create stories which make a competition matter more than it should and things like that. And I certainly did that. Like there'd be times where I'd be aware people had been questioning my ability, for example, and I'd thrive off that. I remember printing off negative comments that people had written about me and having it in my competition bag so I could read that before. That works for me, right? So I run my best when I'm aggressive and angry. A lot of sprinters don't, so that wouldn't. But yeah, so I had a warm-up playlist which got me in the zone and that I refined over time, which kind of got me into that position. So yeah, it was really sort of structured from an early age of this is what you do, and if you go through these steps and you can perform well on the day.
That's really interesting, because you saying that about I perform best when I'm aggressive, and I found I don't know, articles or stories or whatever it might be of people who have criticised me or said that I'm not going to be able to do very well in this particular circumstance. Reminds me of The Last Dance, Michael Jordan, and how he used to hold grudges against opponents, people, and use that to be what I would call, as a psychologist, instrumentally aggressive, not reactive aggression, but instrumental aggression, using a story to increase the feelings of energy, increase the feelings of aggression to drive him on. And it's interesting that you say that helped you, but it wouldn't necessarily help others. It would hinder them.
Yeah, so I guess there's probably been a couple of different stages in sprinting over the years. So probably when I started competing, Maurice Green was the number one sprinter, the US guy, was the world record holder, and he actually ran quite aggressively. Anyway, and a lot of the sprinters then tried to mimic that. And then you saw a complete change from this from probably 2007 onwards. So Asaf Powell, first of all, from Jamaica, and then Usain Bolt from Jamaica, who were deliberately relaxed and playful with it. And then you saw a lot of sprinters try and copy that as well. So like, a lot of the time I was thinking, well, like, have you thought about this? Like, is this what's best for you, or are you just thinking, well, what Usain Bolt does is how you should prepare? Or are there other kind of, is this actually a process which works for you? So yeah, there's definitely been kind of people that come in and out of different styles. But yeah, what I found worked for me was just being very aggressive.
What is it about sprinting that's psychological? I mean, what does the psychological side do that influences your capacity to sprint? Because I would imagine from the outside looking in, a lot of fans, a lot of the layperson would say, well, it's just about running from point A to point B. How can that be psychological?
Yeah, I guess if you want to run as quick as you can, you've got to be in a psychological place to be able to tolerate that pain of running quickly. It's not an obvious pain, but it's like a central nervous system output which is completely maximal, and it kind of occurs you get sort of like a pressure in your head, I find, when you sprint as fast as you can. So you have to be able to be prepared for that. Similarly, like, it's all about producing force, a lot of force in a short period of time. And again, that's physiologically quite challenging to do. So you have to put yourself in a position where you can be motivated to actually do that. And then part of it is just like, well, can you withstand the pressure at the end of the race, whereby there's people around you, you can sense them near you, but what you want to do is try harder at that point in time, but that makes you slower. So you have to take the pressure from other people and use that to actually relax as much as you can to be able to express that force. So there's all those factors that come into that. Similarly, I guess you can be very, very anxious because you can't make a mistake in a 100-meter race. Any small mistake in that race is gone from you. You're on the start line of a 100-meter race, and you can think, well, in 15 seconds' time, I'll know whether I've been successful in my life goal or not. And you've still got to perform well at that point in time. There's a lot of anxiety that has there's potential for a lot of anxiety to be present. And so being able to sort of take that anxiety and still perform is really crucial. So that's probably the performance aspect of it. And then I guess there's just the routine aspect and being able to sort of motivate yourself on a daily basis to do things that are quite hard. Same for all professional sports, really. That's kind of the more general day-to-day sports psychology aspects.
You mentioned the anxiety around making a mistake, that a single mistake can kill your race. What's a mistake? What do you mean a mistake? That doesn't seem very obvious to me. What do you mean?
So, like, if we just look at reaction time, so when the gun goes, you've got to obviously just start your movement, and then you want to do that reasonably quickly. So, like, a fairly good reaction time for most sprinters that you'll see is between 0.12 and 0.16 of a second. If you react in 0.20 of a second, you're probably not going to do much in that race. So you can win or lose a race on that reaction time just there. And that's not, reacting to a gun is not a passive process. Like, you're not just there thinking, okay, when the gun goes, I'm going to move. You're actively listening for a sound, and your whole body is primed and ready to go. But you have the control of your body to make sure that you don't move before that sound happens. So there's things like that. I mean, that really just focuses your mind when you think, if I react in 0.16, I'm fine. If I react in 0.18, I'm probably not winning this race. That's not a large margin for error. Similarly, where you position your feet as you accelerate, if you make a slight lateral movement where you shouldn't, and aspects like that, because the margins are so fine in 100 meters. I get the 2004 Olympics, for example. I think 0.04 of a second separates first from fourth. There's not a lot that has to go wrong for you not to be successful. And also, like, if you just look at normal variation between, like, if you're a scientist doing 100 meters, the difference between first and fourth, you would just call normal variation in performance. That's just like error. But for you as a sprinter, that's not error, as in, like, that's not just noise in the experiment. That's you not winning or winning. So there really is small margins whereby, anything that happens, even a small thing, you get a little bit of pressure from an athlete, you tighten up ever so slightly because of that. They can all come back and haunt you.
What I hear you saying is the psychology of sprinting predominantly revolves around three areas. If we're talking about performance psychology here, the capacity to deal with pain, the ability to relax to be able to express force. So we've got pain and force, and the capacity to get into the right mental state where you aren't so concerned about mistake, error, so you can be free of mistake. So three areas, predominant areas, would you say?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that, yeah.
When you reflect back, the difference between your best, or some of your best, and your worst, or some of your worst performances, I'm not going to do the old give me a percentage in terms of psych, but where did psych play the part there of those three? Difference between your best and your worst?
So my best ever performance was 2009. So in June 2009, I went to Ostrava in the Czech Republic, and I was doing a Grand Prix race there, and I was racing Usain Bolt. Right, so you know that this meet's televised, and you know that you're racing the fastest person to ever run the planet. And there were other people in that race that were very good. That was probably of the 8 people in the race, I think I was ranked 7th on personal best. So I'm going into that race, I'm thinking, this is on TV, right? So people that I know and watch me, I'm going to look stupid if I don't run my absolute best race. And even if I do run my absolute best race, I'm not winning this race because Usain Bolt's in it. So I need everything to go as perfectly as possible for me to just be okay in this race, really. So that was my motivation there, was I know that I need to react exactly when the gun goes. I need my acceleration phase to be perfect. And I need to relax at the back end of the race to be able to express that. And so I was I was really aggressive in that race. I remember on the start line, I'm pacing backwards and forwards. I've somehow developed a twitch in my hand where I'm clicking my finger, which I've never done before that, but I was just so pent up in this energy to perform. And like when you look back at when I look back at my best competitions, you're excited for that competition for a week. So all you think about for the whole week before a competition is, I can't wait to get out there and race. And then you drive to the airport and you're thinking, this is brilliant. Like, I'm going there to be able to do this. I'm so excited about it. The whole day of the competition, because the race was at 9:20 at night, all I can think about is racing and like what an opportunity this is to do something. But if I don't do it properly, I'm going to get found out. So it really just focuses your mind. So yeah, I was just really aggressive on the start line, reacted really well. The gun went at 60 metres, I was winning. You don't remember much of a 100-metre race. The more you remember, the worse you ran, usually. But I remember being at 60 metres and thinking, I'm winning this race. And then the next thing I remember is Usain Bolt just absolutely flying past me. So I was winning at 60 metres, and then he beat me by about 3 or 4 metres. So he took a lot out of me at the back end of the race. And I remember I just held on to come second, and that's where I ran that 10.08 seconds. But then there's competitions where I've gone to where I just haven't been excited to go there. And then I haven't been able to find a reason to run well. And then I guess that becomes perpetuating or self-perpetuating, because you think, in this situation, I don't usually run very well. And once you're in that mindset, it's a lot of effort to pull yourself out of that. And so usually they would have been the smaller meets, or usually there could be a lot of pressure. So I once ran really badly in the national championship 60-metre final in 2008. So Dwayne Chambers had made his comeback from a drugs ban, and I was getting asked fairly frequently what my opinion was about this. And my opinion at the time, and probably still is that if you failed a test for steroids, you should probably be banned for life, which is what Dwayne Chambers had happened. So my opinion was that Dwayne Chambers should be banned for life. That's nothing personal against him. Dwayne Chambers' person is perfectly nice, and he's very personable. But given what had happened, I didn't think he should be running. And so he'd managed to use, I guess, that ongoing feud in his head as fuel to perform, because his perception was that I was slagging him off in the press. So he ran really well. Conversely, I felt the pressure on was that I had to win that race to sort of, prove a point. And I ran terribly. Came fifth, I think. So there's often extraneous circumstances which you've either created yourself or haven't been able to put out of your head, which sort of cause that issue there. So yeah, they're probably the obvious things which come into that. But also, like in 2008 at the Olympics, I was responsible for the Great Britain relay team getting disqualified in the 4x1 relay. So I've written about this a couple of times, so you may have seen some articles, or somebody else who's listed this might have. But I basically I was running last leg, and I left 3 metres too early, which is absolutely criminal in a 4x1 relay. That's 3 metres is daylight. And we got disqualified. We were reigning champions, and we probably would have got at least a silver medal there. I don't have an Olympic medal now because of that. But like, if I look back at what had happened there, the whole setup for that was, I'd never run last leg in a competition before. When I went back and looked at my training performances, because we prioritised fast changeovers, I actually was leaving early quite a lot in training, but just wasn't aware of that. So I was making the mistake that I was made in the competition. And so, yeah, it all came to a head on the day, really.
I mean, that I'm pausing there because that in itself is really interesting. The training relationship with the performance. I think it's fascinating. I think this is so often the unseen thing when spectators watch, the layperson watches, fans watch. The difference between best and worse, and what I heard you say with your best was, I mean, obviously the situation was set up for you to be very excited, but I heard you be aggressive before the race, so I found myself feeling that sense of aggression. You knew that your reaction had to be bang on, acceleration, relax at the back end. It's interesting you said you became conscious halfway through that you were winning. Do you think being conscious halfway through that you were winning impacted the eventual outcome from a time perspective. I'm not saying it from a position perspective, because it's probable, if I may say, that Usain Bolt would have come through, but could you have beaten 10.08 had you, to use a term we'd use in psychology, continued to be focused on the process rather than suddenly conscious of where you were?
I don't know. So I guess there's no races where I don't remember anything from them. Yeah. So I usually find you'd get one or two snapshots within the race, which are often very fleeting moments whereby you had just some mental perception of where you were or something that happened. But the more of those that you had, generally I found the worse the race was. So I generally, one or two thoughts, one or two moments of thought that occur in a race, I would have classed as normal or good. Anything more than that, I was kind of thinking, that's probably a bit much.
So that's interesting, because I'm a big believer in thinking in action. I'm a skeptic when it comes to blank your mind and just compete, whatever discipline you're actually competing in. It's a good thing to have some cues, triggers, and self-monitoring during a race that quick.
Yeah, so I would say, because sprinting is essentially like a central nervous system activity, any thought related to sprinting usually does slow you down. Okay. But specific cues can be useful. So in the blocks, for example, my cue was like, load the legs, so you've got some tension there, and then just wait for a noise, and as soon as you hear a noise, move your right arm. And so that's a routine-based thing that actually calms you down, because you have a process then, which is A has to happen for B to happen for C to happen, but I don't then plan after that. It's a blank specifically, because I know that if I execute that particular skill, everything else is set up to work really well. But then your thought processes are towards the back end of the race. It's just as you're feeling that pressure, it's just maybe a quick reminder, like a click in your head, relax, or just one word like that, which is a cue, which is related to, I guess, sensation or feeling, as opposed to the specific action that you're doing. Because as soon as you start thinking about sprinting, I mean, people can try it themselves. If you go out and run and think about running, you run slower because you're thinking about what your legs need to do and that kind of thing. So yeah, cues were generally, my cues specifically were about reacting to the gun and what I was going to do, what my first movement was going to be, and then just keeping my head as blank as possible, and then just focusing on like words which were related to reducing tension, basically.
Just reflecting briefly on the poorer performances, and you mentioned about not feeling up for it, not getting into that sense of experience of aggression at the smaller meets. There seems to be an interesting, I'm trying to think of a more positive word than contradiction, Craig, so please excuse me, I'll use that word, but contradiction in terms of the phrase I'm thinking here is a rage to master. You eventually had overtraining syndrome, which I want to come on and talk about, but you eventually had overtraining syndrome. You spoke at the beginning of this conversation about feelings of anxiety when going out with friends around what you should and shouldn't be doing and eating. You were very structured. You sounded very driven. You had a rage to master. But then you go to these meets, and perhaps if they don't meet a criteria or a threshold of importance, you feel a sense of a lack of motivation or a sense of demotivation. No question there, mate. Just a comment. There seems to be an interesting contradiction there.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you say. And even now, I'm driven by mastery. So, like, I'm hungry for knowledge. I always like to pick up new things. Like, have a weird obsession with doing postgraduate study. So like I've just finished a doctorate. Now I'm thinking, well, what else can I do to do that? So that's what's important to me, is actually like finding something interesting and then trying to become very good at that. I actually enjoy the process a lot. I wonder if some athletes, and I would class myself in this, become somewhat reliant on, possibly addicted to, the sensations associated with nervousness, stress and anxiety, and require that to perform well. So you'll see quite a common thing is the post-Olympic blues that athletes have. They go to the Olympics, it's something they could focus on for a long period of time. they perform well there, and then afterwards they struggle at other competitions because it's not the Olympics. And what they've been through at the Olympics has shown them that they can tolerate that stress and anxiety. And when there's no stress and anxiety associated with this competition, because it doesn't really mean anything, they struggle to perform. And that became apparent to me after I went to the World Under 18 Championships. So a lot of stress and anxiety there, which led to some success. And then after that, I was at meetings thinking, well, this isn't the World Under 18 Championships. The sensations aren't anywhere near the same. If I win or lose this race, nobody cares, really. So there's nothing riding on this. So yeah, I became reliant or needed a little bit of nervousness or a little bit of thrive off doubt sometimes, I would say. So like questioning my own ability to perform, that's a really positive thing for me to be in. Sounds counterintuitive again, but going to competition, I have to have the element of doubt. Can I actually do this? That's what I need to perform well. And then when it doesn't really matter if you can or can't do it, that's when performance isn't at its best.
So if Elon Musk suddenly invented a time machine, because he seems the likely person to do that, and you were able to get in that time machine and go back to that period, everything you've just said in the last couple of minutes, would you strive to manage that? Would that be a feature of self-development?
Possibly. I mean, what I would say is when I had to perform, I did, usually. So I wonder if it's not necessarily... It's certainly negative on the day that you go to competition and don't perform well. But I wonder if overall for your course of the season, whether that having those bad races actually spurs you on, because then you have a bad race and then you find people are saying, well, has he still got it? And that's the motivation you need for the next race. So I wonder if actually I needed trauma and anxiety and self-doubt to have my better performances. And I wonder if getting rid of those would have actually harmed my better days. I don't know the answer, but that's certainly something that I would keep in mind.
So you wouldn't change anything in that respect?
Yeah, I don't genuinely look back at many things and think,
sure.
Well, I try and be as philosophical as possible, which is, I mean, my life's quite good right now and I wouldn't necessarily change what's gone before it. Even the bad times, I've learned a lot from them, and I'm able to take learnings from that into my current role and things like that. So I don't sort of wish anything that had happened hadn't happened, and that probably sounds strange because I missed Olympic Games with surgery. I've had to miss another Olympic Games with a serious back injury, and I've got disqualified at another Olympic Games. But no, I mean, they're quite important experiences in me as a context of a person.
I want to talk about that overtraining in a second. Forgive me for this, because you'll probably ask this all the time. The Usain Bolt question. Well, maybe my question might be slightly different. I mean, incredible that you went up against him. I mean, my perception as a sports psychologist, and I might be completely naive here, is that psychology doesn't really play much of a role. Maybe other than, as you mentioned earlier, who he is, the meso systems, the macro systems he comes from within the community he came from and made him the person that he is. There's got to be something there that influences, of course, but for me, was he just physically that much superior?
Oh yeah, he definitely was physically much superior. I mean, he is, I guess, probably until Usain Bolt came along, he would have been classed as too tall to be a sprinter, but he's kind of redesigned the mould from that aspect. But I mean, he has the fastest 60-metre split ever, I believe. He's got the fastest flying 30 split ever. I mean, he is physically there. I mean, he gets a bit of a bad press, I think, from his perceived psychological preparation, which I think he plays up to be honest, a bit. I don't know if you remember, but at 2011 World Championships, Usain Bolt was disqualified for a false start in the final. And I had probably the most uncomfortable moment of my life is I was 45 minutes after that race, I was in a lift with Usain Bolt, just me, Usain Bolt and his agent. And he was not taking that on the chin. He was dejected. So you could see it meant a lot for him to not be in that race. And there'd been a couple of other times, you see him motivating himself. He is actually very driven. I don't know him particularly well, but away from the track, you do see that this matters quite a lot to him. So what you see on the camera is not necessarily all of what Usain Bolt is. It certainly is a lot of what he is, but it's not all of it.
So there's an element whereby he probably worked a bit harder than maybe is made out. There's a sort of a game face by design, that relaxed game face, if you like. But there's a rage to master in him a little bit as well.
Yeah, so I mean, he won the world under 20 championships when he was 15, I think, or 15 or 16, and then he had a couple of years where he was actually injured and not progressing well, and like you get bits of information, which is that he changed a lot based on that. There, he didn't just accept that injury; he made changes around it. He and his coach sought quite a lot of answers from quite a lot of experts. That's not something you do if you're not that motivated. So he definitely was motivated to perform. Yeah. I mean, he was very physically talented. I suspect there were some days where he didn't really try that hard at training. But there are videos of him running quick splits over 300 meters, which would be horrendously painful. And he's doing them much quicker than most people would. So he's still the capacity to tolerate pain and the willingness to go there. So yeah, he's potentially more motivated than a lot of people would have thought.
You mentioned suffering from overtraining syndrome. Can you tell me a little bit about that? What is that? What do you mean? And what did you experience?
So 2009, I came fourth at the national championships, which meant I wasn't picked to compete for Great Britain in the 100 metres at the World Championships. They picked the top three. So if you judge success or failure as do you go to the World Championships that year, I viewed 2009 as a failure, and I wasn't picked I was selected in the relay squad, but I wasn't picked in the team that actually ran, and they got a bronze medal. So off the back of that, I was like, well, I can't really accept this. I'm 22. I need to be pushing on a bit. So my reaction to that was obviously just to train harder, which, like I said, is not a good idea. So your coach gives you a training program. It's well thought out. So he writes, okay, Friday in the gym, you're doing 6 sets of power cleans. That's 75% effort. And I would just put as much weight on the bar as I could possibly on that day and lift it. I wasn't lifting. I wasn't doing the training that he was prescribing. I was just trying to make the training as hard as possible. And so as a result of that, your sprint performances go down. And then you think, okay, well, I'm not running as fast as I need to. I need to run harder. I need to try harder. So then every session becomes an effort to get yourself up for it, because you're trying to arrest a slide down a slope. But actually what you need is recovery. But what you think you need is to train harder. And I just got myself into a hole that I couldn't get out of. So I would train badly, come home, sit on the sofa and just be not motivated to do anything. I would play Football Manager on my laptop for 6 hours straight. You find it'd be dark outside, you'd just be on the sofa where you came in from training in the middle of the day. And then I started doing a couple of races. I wasn't running particularly well. Went to see the sports doctor, basically to get diagnosed with overtraining syndrome. They test you for everything else it could possibly be. If you don't have those, it's overtraining syndrome. So there's a lot of explorations that go on. You have a lot of blood tests, and then invariably they find some incidental finding in your blood tests, which is not relevant, but it could be, so they have to explore that. So it just ended up being a long process. Probably the plus side of that is that during that year, I actually suffered a reasonably bad hamstring injury, which meant I ended up having 12 weeks, I think, or maybe 10 weeks where I couldn't sprint. So I actually got some enforced rest off the back of that, which was really useful. And then I also changed coaches during that time, so there's probably some sort of like mental stagnation going on at the same point in time. So yeah, I had managed to get a long period of physical recovery. I had a new challenge psychologically with changing training groups and things like that, and managed to get back to a decent shape the year afterwards. But it's not a nice sensation having overtraining syndrome. You just feel tired all the time, and there's nothing you can do to address that quickly. It just takes a long time.
So, again, if I may ask, if you could go back, what would you have done differently?
Well, I would not have trained as hard. I would have become less interested in monitoring every aspect of my training, because actually there's just days where you just have to turn up and do some sort of work, right? But if you're thinking, well, if you're thinking every day you're in the gym, you have to lift as much weight as possible, then you can't do that forever. Similarly, every time you sprint, if you want the timing gates out to check how you're doing, you can't do that forever. And then part of that is going to be driven by anxiety, right? So If you're anxious to perform, then you want to time everything so that you can get positive feedback. But if the times aren't good, there's no positive feedback from there, and you want to sort of put that right the time afterwards. So I would definitely spend less time testing myself in training. Another thing I was doing is that, I thought probably a good way to have some success is to lose a bit of weight. So I wasn't eating much food at the same point in time. The AIS have just come out with a disordered eating paper position stand, and if I look at some of the things that are in there, like I definitely had I didn't have an eating disorder, but I had disordered eating, and I was using it as a crux to lose weight, and probably then using training as a mechanism for weight loss as well, which it never should be, but it was for me at that point in time. So yeah, I was training too hard, not fueling myself enough, and then probably from a psychological perspective, I'd finished my sports science degree at Bath and was just a full-time athlete, so I actually didn't have any other thing to keep me occupied, which didn't help either.
Craig, I work heavily in football, soccer, over here in England, and something I often find myself talking about with coaches, the description I often have, because obviously it's a team sport, and sometimes the individual is forgotten about within the team, the individual gets lost, and I talk to coaches about the system around the player. What system are we putting in place around the player? Listening to you speak, it kind of feels like the system that may have been working really well became broken, whether because of a narrative around, again, coming back to your high conscientiousness. I've got a rage to master. I want to be the best that I can be. I love routine. I love orderliness. I want to tick the boxes, cross the T's, dot the I's. And that, I'm not saying that broke the system. I'm just saying that maybe that rage to master took you away from an effective system. Whereas perhaps if there had been somebody there to help you put in place a system with the right people and the right processes, there may have been a slightly different sense of well-being at the time, and different goals, different objectives, and different performances.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, the backstory to this as well is that I had two training partners before 2009 that then left, so I was essentially the only sprinter in my training group. So when you instead of having that camaraderie and also getting a perspective of where you are relative to those two, the only perspective is what's on the clock, and so yeah, you become more focused on that. Whereas I guess if you're training with two other people, your bad sessions are actually probably going to correlate with theirs because of how fatigue is going to work if training's working properly. So you're all going to have a bad session together, but you won't view it as a bad session because you're just perceiving how your performances is relative to them. And if they're having a drop off, then it looks like your session's just fairly normal. So yeah, there's definitely, I guess, systematic issues within that. I mean, I have to take a lot of responsibility for it myself because of, I guess, my personality probably predisposes me to that kind of problem anyway.
So there feels like there could have been plenty of entry points for a relationship with a sports psych to be able to help you understand yourself, your characteristic, your personality characteristics, what helps you, what hinders you.
Yeah, it definitely would have been. Yeah, it would have been. That time actually coincided with an obsession with trying mindfulness and imagery. So basically, it didn't work for me because it's just another thing that you can monitor your performance on. So I actually find it quite stressful to think I have to have a 20-minute spot here or I can do mindfulness. After now, I find 10 minutes where I can go in later. So I was like, I'm not good at this. And I can't see myself getting better at it. So it actually became an additional thing which for me to obsess over and monitor my performance on, which was a really useful lesson for me, which is that, okay, the theory behind these things is solid, but on reflection, when it comes to imagery works for me in an unstructured format. So when I was a kid going to school, I used to just fall into daydreams on the bus on the way to school, which were I'd be imagining competitions. Similarly, if I was driving to training or driving to the airport for a competition, I would just naturally fall into this unstructured, unplanned imagery. As soon as it became planned, which you think is a good thing, actually lost a lot of its usefulness for me. So that was a really good way for me to think, well, actually, sometimes you've just got to, naturally, you maybe have some psychological gifts which you've been able to sort of work with thus far, and you should just trust that process a little bit more, like your natural ability to have it positive imagery, as opposed to structuring it a little bit more.
It's really interesting because all this resonates with me, Craig, because I was a professional golfer, and I think we're quite similar in as much as, you were a far more successful sprinter than I was a golfer, but what really, where there's comparison, is I got lost in the detail because I thought the detail was going to get me where I wanted to go. We've probably got quite similar personalities in that respect, and I just felt I must, if I'm going to eat properly, I must have these 2 bananas at this time. Yeah. I must do this at this time. I must do that, and probably akin to you putting on a heavier weights when you shouldn't have done. I would be practicing for 8 hours. Now, golf being golf, you can get injured, of course you can, but I didn't get injured, I just burnt out, and I got worse. I was a worse golfer at the age of 23 than I was, say, at 17, 18, and I wasn't diagnosed, or don't think I experienced overtraining syndrome in the format that you're talking about, but if there's such a thing as over-practice syndrome, that was certainly me, so a lot of this resonates with me. Just last couple of questions. I just want to bring us up to present day. How does this, how do your experiences influence what you do now, how you speak with, how you communicate with the athletes you're working with or interacting with now?
So I think from a communication standpoint, a lot of the athletes I work with are probably aged 16 to 21. So it just helps build credibility in as much as that I've been through what they've been through. In fact, I've probably been through a lot worse than they've been through. So they know that I'm not just somebody that's saying I understand, I actually do understand, and I can give them advice, which is hard won, I guess, through that kind of thing. But it also, I guess, as a pathways manager, basically, like you alluded to, I have to build systems around athletes to be able to progress them on. So it just sort of indicates to me that you can have athletes with a lot of physical talent, but if you haven't laid the framework from a psychological perspective, you're not going to have them be successful. But then similarly, my experiences are the psychological skills that I developed as an athlete, they serve you really well in the real world. So there's a lot of transference there. And when you're working with promising athletes, the reality is that most of them aren't going to compete for Australia as an athlete, as much as we'd like them to. Just the law of numbers suggests that's not going to happen. So if we can give them really positive enjoyment opportunities, but then positive skills that they can take into other environments, then that's really, really useful as well. And then from, I guess, a performance health perspective, if I look back on my career, I had to retire because of injury, missed Olympics because of an injury, had overtraining syndrome, multiple hamstring injuries. If they hadn't happened, things potentially could have been different. So I'm really proactive on trying to increase education to the athletes and their coaches to say, look, these are things you need to consider a little bit more. It's not just physical load, there's psychological load around that as well. And if you just think that physiological load is what matters, you're missing quite a large piece of the puzzle here. So it's just trying to make them aware of all these different factors that play into it and various different things they can do to support that. And then probably the final aspect of that is that I think traditionally coaches view sports psychology as something a sports psychologist does, but instead it's trying to make them realise that actually if you're a coach, you're the person that athlete sees more than anybody else. So you really are the sports psychologist, and so we need to make sure you have the skills and the abilities to at least do a decent job there, design training sessions to make sure they can cope with the demands of competition and things like that. And they're probably things that I wouldn't have done 10 years ago because I would have thinking it's just physical. But having been through this and made mistakes, I realised that actually the psychological part of it is massively important. So it's just about getting processes in place to support that.
And with regard to those processes, how do you get much pushback from coaches?
It differs. So ones that have been successful before where they haven't had to think about this, it's obvious. It's an easy thing for them to say, well, I didn't need this when athlete X achieved medal Y, so why do I need it now? but then you get probably and not all of the experienced coaches like that, or some of them are really switched onto it. But I'd say as a rule, you probably find the younger coaches, I would say they tend to have more of a sports science-esque background, which means they're more aware of these things anyway. So yeah, it completely depends. I mean, yeah, you'll get some coaches that think this is great. You'll get some coaches that go like, didn't need this in my day. And you'll have some people that were former athletes who, again, will say, well, we didn't have this when I was successful, so why do we need it now? And that probably ignores, I guess, generational differences that happen. There are differences between people that were athletes 40 years ago and that are athletes now, and different requirements, different ways to communicate, things like that. So it all sort of falls under the same umbrella, I think.
Interesting. I think my last thing to say here is it sounds to me like, as a pathway manager, given your experiences and given what you know about sports science and the practical side of athletics, it sounds like you're trying to help coaches and athletes negotiate between ambition and developing effective systems and processes, trying to hit that sweet spot of development, I suppose.
Yeah, but also, I guess, just life and just making sure that there are other things outside of this. Although right now, the point that you're at, this seems like it absolutely is a life or death scenario. It actually isn't. In 10 years' time, you won't remember this moment, really. You might actually get positives out of it. So with COVID-19 now, there's a prime example. So seen the Olympic Games postponed, with the World Under-20 Championships postponed. A lot of athletes are thinking, well, I'll never go to World Under-20 Championships now. And you think, well, yeah, that matters today, but in 10 years' time, you might not remember this. And so there's other things that you can focus on. So it's a kind of just trying to sort of make them aware of that, show them the way when it comes to, what's the next goal you can focus on, how can you keep moving forward, where's the opportunity in this. So for some of these athletes, the Olympics in 2020 would have been too soon for them. The Olympics in 2021 isn't too soon for them. The extra year's training is really positive for them. So now that's a positive opportunity for them, where they can miss the 2020 Olympics because they wouldn't have qualified, and they put themselves in the position to qualify in 2021. So it's always about just trying to sort of find the opportunity in this. Sometimes it's hard to see what the opportunity is when you have something which feels overwhelmingly negative, but there actually is a positive in this. You've just got to try and find it and frame it a little bit more.
I'm thinking there of a broadening of objectives to bring in life objectives, and a broadening of narrative, because narrative can be so narrow with athletes. It's today, tomorrow, it's the next event, it's winning, I don't know, a medal at the Olympics or whatever. Whereas it sounds to me like you're trying to broaden the narrative and broaden the objectives.
Yeah, and I guess as well, the word pathway doesn't necessarily help that, because people say pathway and they view this as a linear stepping stone process. What I'm trying to pass on here is that there is no one pathway. Your pathway might be you spend 3 years at this stepping stone, then you go back a stepping stone, and then suddenly move forward 6. Whereas just because your friend has moved forward 3 this year, they might stay there and you'll overtake them eventually. So I think there's probably a perception that to be an Olympic champion, you have to go to the World Under-20 Championships, for example. Naturally, that's just not the case. There's multiple ways to get there, provided we can just see the positives and frame it that way, and then be robust enough to take it on the chin. Hopefully, these athletes be successful in the future.
Fascinating stuff. Craig, wow, thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed that hour. And I know that a lot of the stuff we've spoken about and a lot of stuff you said, people will be really interested in tapping into more of your expertise. And you've got an amazing blog, mate. I mean, I was going through all of your blog articles. If you're a sports science nut, it's perfect. So if you want to be findable, if you want to be contactable, do you use social media? How can people follow you? How can people read your blog?
Yeah, I guess social media is probably the best place to find me. So on Twitter, I'm at Craig100. If you go on there, you'll see everything that I put out. I tend to tweet all the articles that I've written and things like that. So yeah, that's definitely the place to keep in contact. And if people want to message me on there, I'm more than happy to speak to people about various different things.
Perfect. Craig, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me exactly what you think of the Sports Psych show, and if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.